Thomas Aquinas was an Italian Dominican friar, philosopher, and theologian who became one of the most influential medieval thinkers of the Western world. His integration of the philosophical principles of Aristotle with the theology of the Christian faith set the framework for the Catholic theology and helped develop the system known as scholasticism, which sought to reconcile faith and reason. Aquinas is best known for his major work, the Summa Theologica, a monumental treatise that covers the full breadth of Christian theology and philosophy. His teachings on the natural law, the virtues, and the relationship between faith and reason have had a profound and lasting impact on Christian theology and Western philosophical thought. And if you want to learn about him, you're certainly in the right place. Hello and welcome to the channel. If you are new here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, it's great to have you back here with me again. As always, if you'd like to support the channel, if you like what I do, and want to help keep me going, links to the Patreon are in the description and comments. Otherwise, help YouTube push the video out to a greater audience by liking, commenting, and subscribing if you feel inclined to do so. Now, without further ado, let's get on to our life of Thomas Aquinas. Please first make yourself comfortable, and we may begin. Thomas Aquinas, born around 1225 in the family castle of Roccaseca near Aquino in the kingdom of Sicily, was destined for a religious career from an early age. His family was part of the southern Italian nobility, with his father, Landulf of Aquino, serving as a knight under Emperor Frederick II. Unlike his brothers, who pursued military careers, Thomas was intended to follow his uncle into the abbacy of Monte Cassino, the oldest Benedictine monastery. At just 5 years old, Thomas began his early education at Monte Cassino. However, the ongoing military conflict between Emperor Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX soon disrupted his stay, leading his parents to enroll him at the University of Naples. There, Thomas was introduced to the works of Aristotle, Averroes, and Maimonides, which deeply influenced his theological philosophy. He also came under the influence of John of St. Julian, a Dominican preacher, whose teachings inspired Thomas to join the Dominican order at the age of 19. His decision to join the Dominicans was met with fierce opposition from his family, particularly from his mother, Theodora. To prevent him from pursuing a religious life, his family held him captive in their castles at Monte San Giovanni and Roccaseca for nearly a year. That's right, he was effectively grounded. During this period, Thomas tutored his sisters and maintained communication with the Dominicans. His family's efforts to dissuade him included a rather humorous attempt to break his faith and tempt him by hiring a lady of the night. That's one way of doing it. But unfortunately, this event only strengthened his resolve, and apparently led to a mystical experience in which he was granted the celestial gift of perfect chastity. Certainly a backfire for his parents, I'm sure. Well, in 1244, finally realizing that her efforts were futile, Theodora arranged for Thomas to escape from captivity in secret. This allowed him to maintain his dignity and that of his family. Thomas then traveled to Naples and Rome, where he officially joined up with the Dominican order under Johannes von Wildeshausen, the Master General. In 1245, a year later, Thomas Aquinas began his studies at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Paris, which was one of the leading centers of academic learning in the medieval world at the time. It was here that he likely first encountered Albertus Magnus, a prominent Dominican scholar and chair of theology at the College of St. James in Paris. This meeting would prove significant, as Albertus would become Thomas's mentor and guide in the early stages of his academic and also theological career. When Albertus was transferred to Cologne in 1248 to teach at the newly established Studium Generale, Thomas followed him there, choosing to continue his studies under Albertus rather than accept the position of abbot at Monte Cassino, which was offered to him personally by Pope Innocent IV. This decision marked Thomas's deep commitment to the Dominican order and his pursuit of an academic career. In Cologne, Albertus recognized Thomas's potential and appointed him Magister Studentium. Despite Thomas's quiet demeanor, which led some to underestimate him, Albertus famously predicted that Thomas would one day produce a bellowing in his teachings that would resonate across the entire world. During his time in Cologne, Thomas served as an apprentice professor, teaching on the Old Testament and writing commentaries on the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Lamentations. His early academic work displayed his growing interest in biblical studies and his capability as a scholar. In 1252, Thomas returned to Paris to pursue a master's degree in theology. He lectured as an apprentice professor on the Bible, and his studies culminated in his commentary on Peter Lombard's Sentences, a foundational theological text of the medieval period. This work, along with others such as De Ente et Essentia, highlight his deepening understanding of both theology but also philosophy. By 1256, 4 years later, Thomas had achieved the coveted position of Regent Master in Theology at Paris. One of his first significant works in this capacity was Contra Impugnantes de Cultum e Religionem, sorry for the Latin pronunciation, in which he defended the mendicant orders against critics like William of St. Amour. This period was incredibly productive for Thomas, as he authored several key texts that contributed to his reputation as a premier theologian and professor. These works included Questiones Disputate de Veritate, a collection of disputed questions that he addressed during public debates, effectively a FAQ, and also extensive commentaries on the works of Boethius. Throughout his tenure in Paris, Thomas's work continued to evolve, culminating in the beginning of his efforts on Summa Contra Gentiles, one of his most famous and comprehensive works, aimed at explicating and defending the Christian faith against dissenting views. This work, among others, solidified his place as one of the most influential thinkers of the Middle Ages. And if you ask a lot of people about what their main work of Thomas Aquinas was. Don't be surprised if they do say Summa contra Gentiles. But that, of course, was not the first, but also definitely not the last. In 1259, after completing his first regency at the Studium Generale in Paris, Thomas left the city to provide teaching opportunities to other members of his order. He returned to Naples, where he was appointed as the general preacher by the provincial chapter on September the 29th, 1260. The following year, he was summoned to Orvieto to serve as the conventual lector, responsible for pastoral formation of friars who could not attend a studium generale. Now, during his time in Orvieto, Thomas completed many more significant works, including the finalized version of Summa contra Gentiles and the Golden Chain, Catena Aurea, and several works that were commissioned by Pope Urban IV, such as the Liturgy for the newly established Feast of Corpus Christi and Contra Errores Graecorum, against the errors of the Greeks. He also composed hymns for the Feast of Corpus Christi, including the Pange Lingua and the Panis Angelicus, which remained part of the Christ liturgy today, the Church's liturgy, rather, Now, in February 1265, newly elected Pope Clement IV summoned Thomas to Rome to serve as papal theologian. That same year, he was directed by the Dominican chapter of Agnani to teach at the Stadium Conventuale at the Roman convent of Santa Sabina, which was founded in 1222. This studium was now designated as the order's first studium provinciale, a more advanced school that bridged the gap between the simpler convent schools and the Studium Generale, kind of a middle ground. Now, while there at Santa Sabina, Thomas began his most famous work, the Summa Theologiae. This work was intended as a teaching tool for beginners in theology, laying out the Christian religion in a way that was accessible to those new to the subject. Kind of like Christianity 101, how to answer all of those pesky questions from the people who are thinking too much and all of the other little details that you would need to know. He also wrote other significant theological works during this period, including the unfinished Compendium Theologiae and the Responsio ad Vir Leonanum Verscalensum de Articulus, and I'm not going to read the rest of it. There is simply too much Latin, I'm afraid. Now, Thomas also conducted a series of disputations on the power of God, which were later compiled into his work De Potentia. His teaching at the Santa Sabina Studium had a significant impact, and he trained numerous future scholars and church leaders, including notable ones such as Nicholas Brunacchi and the blessed Tomasello de Perugia. Now, in 1268, Thomas was called back to Paris for a second teaching regency. His departure marked the end of his direct involvement with the Santa Sabina Studium, which he continued to evolve and expand. Now, the theological component of the provincial curriculum was later moved to the new covenant at the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which had initially been established as a community for women converts. This studium was eventually transformed into the College of St. Thomas in the 16th century, and in the 20th century it became the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, also known as the Angelicum. In 1268, Thomas Aquinas was reassigned by the Dominican order to the University of Paris for his second regency. This move was influenced by the emergence of Averroism, or radical Aristotelianism at the university, which posed significant challenges to Orthodox Christian teachings. Thomas was deeply concerned about the compatibility of these teachings with the Christian doctrine, prompting him to write De Unitate Intellectus contra Averroistas, or On the Unity of Intellect against the Averroists. This work targeted the Averroist beliefs that all humans share a single intellect, a view which, Thomas argued, was contrary to the faith. During this period, Thomas also wrote the work On the Eternity of the World against Grumblers. That's right, those pesky grumblers, we can't have them. Addressing the Aristotelian concept that the world had no temporal being, which of course also conflicted with the traditional Christian doctrine of creation. The friction between Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology was a central theme of his works during this time. He also sought to reconcile faith with reason. Thomas's second regency was marked by intellectual disputes, particularly with members of the Franciscan order. A year prior to his return to Paris, Franciscan master William of Ballione had sharply criticized Thomas, accusing him of fostering Averroist thought among his students. The accusation had likely stemmed from a few misunderstandings, or perhaps doctrinal rivalry, rather than any genuine doctrinal deviance on Thomas's part. The tension around Averroism and its implications for Christian teachings was palpable. On December the 10th, 1270, Etienne Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, officially condemned 13 Aristotelian and Averroistic propositions as heretical, excommunicating anyone who adhered to them. This condemnation was a clear sign of the Church's resistance to philosophical ideas that seemed to threaten its doctrinal purity. In response to these controversies, Thomas engaged in a series of academic disputations aimed at clarifying and defending the Christian understanding of virtues and hope. These included works such as On Virtues in General, On Cardinal Virtues, and On Hope. These works were part of his broader effort to demonstrate that the Aristotelian philosophy, when correctly interpreted, and that's the important part, could be harmonized with Christian theology. You can have both, but you'll have to make a few concessions. In 1272, Thomas left the University of Paris, following a request from the Dominicans in his home province to establish and lead a new Studium Generale. He chose Naples for this institution, where he also took on the role of regent master. During his time in Naples, Thomas continued to work on the third part of the Summa Theologica, and lectured on various theological topics. He was also known for his popular sermons delivered daily throughout Lent, addressing fundamental Christian tenets like the commandments, the creed, the Our Father, and the Hail Mary. Thomas Aquinas is associated with several mystical experiences and phenomena, including, apparently, a few reported cases of levitation. G.K. Chesterton, among others, noted that Thomas had ecstasies where he levitated above the ground, and during one such experience at the chapel of St. Nicholas in the Dominican convent of Naples, he reportedly had a vision of Christ. According to tradition, Christ asked Thomas what reward he desired for his writings, to which Thomas replied, "Nothing but you, my Lord." How sweet. Well, on December 6th, 1273, Thomas underwent a profound experience while celebrating Mass, leading him to view all of his written works as, and I quote, straw. This event significantly affected him, causing him to cease writings and dictations to his assistant, Reginald of Piperno. As a result, the Summa Theologica remained unfinished. The specific nature of the vision or revelation that led to this decision remains unknown, but it is believed to involve a direct encounter with the divine. The reason why the divine told him to stop writing the Summa Theologica is a mystery of its own. I suppose we'll never really know. In 1274, Pope Gregory X summoned Thomas to the Second Council of Lyon to discuss the reunification of the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches. Thomas had previously written against the errors of the Greeks for Pope Urban IV, which was to be presented at the council. Remember, at this time there was a split in the church. Over in the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, they believed in a different kind of Christianity, while back in the Roman world, if we may still call it that at this point, it was a more Catholic orthodoxy. Well, however, while traveling to Lyon, he met a little bit of bad luck, and he suffered a severe head injury that led to his eventual death. He became ill again and stopped at the Cistercian Fossanova Abbey, where he spent 5 days. During his last rites, he reaffirmed his faith and the teachings he had written about, particularly concerning the Eucharist and the Roman Church. Thomas Aquinas passed away then on the 7th of March, 1274, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most influential theologians and philosophers of the Middle Ages, whose works continue to be studied for their insightful integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, deeply impacting the intellectual landscape of Western Christianity and filling out the next half hour of this video. In 1277, Bishop Etienne Dompierre of Paris, who had previously issued a condemnation in 1270, issued a more extensive list of censures that included 219 propositions deemed to be heretical. Among these were 20 propositions associated with Thomas Aquinas, which initially damaged his reputation severely. Of course, he wasn't around to refute them because he'd been dead for 3 years. It's very easy to throw accusations at people when they can't have the ability to fight back. Well, this condemnation aimed to assert the transcendence of God's absolute power beyond the constraints of Aristotelian and Averroistic logic. Well, despite this early setback, Thomas's theological contributions, posthumously, began to gain recognition and real prestige by the 1300s. Dante Alighieri, the one who wrote the Divine Comedy, completed around 1321, depicted Thomas Aquinas among the great religious sages in the heaven of the sun. Dante even suggested that Thomas died from poisoning orchestrated by Charles of Anjou, a claim also noted by other contemporary writers, though this assertion does lack historical corroboration and is contradicted by accounts from Thomas's friends that suggest a natural death a little while after that head injury. And just a little side note, I will have a full video on Dante Alighieri soon, and perhaps another video on each different part of the Divine Comedy, as there were 3 of them. Effectively, within the Divine Comedy, depending on how much Dante liked you, would be where you would be put. There were some people, especially in the first book, the Inferno, who were placed in rather horrible places at the bottom pits of hell. Of course, these were people that Dante saw as worthy of being there. Conversely, the ones up in the highest echelons of the third book, Paradiso, were people who Dante looked upon quite favorably. So, Dante, placing him in this position in the Divine Comedy, may simply be a reflection of Dante's personal sort of opinions about him. That being said, his work was not censored by any church officials, and Thomas Aquinas was left there, so we may also assume that it was somewhat of a general opinion. Anyway, sorry for going off topic. Back to Thomas. The impact of Thomas Aquinas was such that during his canonization process, that's when you make somebody a saint to canonize someone, was challenged by the devil's advocate about the lack of miracles. A cardinal famously retorted that Thomas's works were as miraculous as they were scholarly, stating in Latin, tot miraculus quod articulus, as many miracles as articles. Thomas was canonized by Pope John the 22nd on the 18th of July, 1323. Now, Thomas's remains have had a history of relocations. Initially buried at Fossanova Abbey, his relics were moved to the Church of the Jacobins in Toulouse on the 28th of January, 1369. They stayed there until the disruptions of the French Revolution, after which they were held in the Basilica of Saint-Sernin until 1974, when they were returned to the Church of the Jacobins, where they remain to this day. Thomas's feast day was originally on the 7th of March, the day of his death, but it was moved to the 28th of January. By 1969, revision of the general Roman calendar, due to the Lenten season often coinciding with his feast day. He is also recognized with a lesser festival on the 28th of January in some Anglican churches. Recognized as a doctor of the Church in 1567 by Pope Pius V, Thomas was placed alongside the great Latin fathers of the Church. His teachings then became central to Catholic education, particularly after Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris of 1879, which endorsed Thomistic philosophy as the cornerstone of Catholic theological education. Thomas was declared a patron saint of all Catholic educational establishments in 1880, and in fact there is a school named after him, quite nearby to a friend of mine's home. I'm not going to tell you exactly nearby. Nobody wants to get doxxed. Now, Bertrand Russell's critique of Thomas Aquinas highlights a fundamental philosophical difference between the scholastic method employed by Aquinas and the more exploratory questioning approach typical of figures like the Platonic Socrates. Russell points out that Aquinas began his philosophical inquiries with a predetermined truth set out by the Catholic faith, which means his philosophical exercises often aim at justifying or explaining this preset truth, rather than discovering new truths through reason alone. It's called confirmation bias. Now, according to Russell, this method qualifies more as special pleading than genuine philosophical inquiry, because the conclusions are fixed in advance, and the process is all about aligning the reasoning with these conclusions. Russell's example regarding Thomas's views on marriage further illustrates this criticism. Aquinas argued for the indissolubility of marriage based on the roles and perceived capabilities of parents, to which modern sensibilities may appear somewhat outdated or biased, particularly in his claims about the rationality of fathers compared to mothers in their roles of discipline. Russell uses this example to emphasize that followers of Aquinas might adhere to his conclusions about marriage not because of the strength of his arguments, but by modern standards, but because they align with broader theological or doctrinal commitments. This critique touches on the larger debate about the role of philosophy in relation to theology, especially in medieval contexts, where theological commitments often framed philosophical inquiry. While Aquinas is celebrated for synthesizing Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, Russell's critique reflects a modern philosophical perspective that more so values independent inquiry and follows arguments to their logical conclusions regardless of prior commitment or beliefs. This kind of detached academia is kind of like saying, instead of "we don't know, let's find out." In the strictly ecclesiastical sense, it's like, "we know, and let's find a way to confirm our biases." Well, either way, Thomas Aquinas' theological framework is a pivotal synthesis of Christian doctrine and Aristotelian philosophy, which aims to reconcile faith and reason within this comprehensive system of thought. He asserts that both faith and reason are essential for understanding the truth about God. But does one come before the other? Is it an even scale? And is reason really reasonable if it contradicts the set principles of the Church? If we were to make an argument based in reason that would go against orthodoxy, well, it's all of a sudden unreasonable. Well, let's have a look at just a few of Thomas's views, taken from his writings, and try to understand a little bit more about where he was coming from. Starting, of course, with his theological approach and natural theology. Thomas views theology, or sacred doctrine, not as some kind of philosophy, but as a science, not in the modern sense of empirical investigation, but as an organized body of knowledge that progresses from these fundamental principles. He argues that this body of knowledge arises both from human reason, natural revelation, and divine revelation, supernatural revelation. Natural revelation involves what can be known of God through reason alone, such as the existence of God and his attributes, which Thomas thought could be demonstrated philosophically. Supernatural revelation, conveyed through scripture and church tradition, includes truths beyond the grasp of reason. For example, let's say the Trinity and incarnation. These things that are just that little bit over our heads in terms of the church's reasoning and understanding of what the general population should have a grasp on. Integration of faith and reason. For Thomas Aquinas, reason is not only compatible with faith, but a necessary component of it. He suggests that reason can explore the truths of divine revelation without contradicting them, suggesting that God's creation, i.e. nature, and God's revelation, i.e. scripture, ultimately come from the same divine source, and must therefore be coherent with each other. When discrepancies arise, they are of course due to human errors, either in scientific understandings or in scriptural interpretations, not because of the fault in the truths themselves. Philosophical and theological contributions. Existence of God. Thomas is well known for his 5 ways, these logical arguments that lead to the proof of the existence of God by his standard. These include the argument from motion, causation, possibility and necessity, degrees of perfection, and governance of the world. Drawing on the works of earlier theologians like Augustine and incorporating these Aristotelian principles, he discusses God's nature extensively. He utilizes both affirmative or cataphatic theology, which articulates what God is, and negative, apophatic theology, which explains what God is not. This innovative approach led to the development of what is known as existential theology, emphasizing God's existence as his essence. Moral and virtue theory. Thomas's moral philosophy, which includes discussions on the virtues, law, and ethics, is another notable area where he applies Aristotelian thought to Christian doctrine. He views virtues as habits, that dispose individuals to act in accordance with reason and faith. The reception of Thomas Aquinas' ideas was initially mixed, facing criticism and even outright condemnation. However, over time his synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian thought gained significant acceptance and was eventually even officially endorsed by the Catholic Church themselves. Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris of 1879 underscores this endorsement by urging a revival of Thomistic philosophy as a response to the modern crisis of faith and reason. Thomas's philosophical and theological exploration into the nature of God, the universe, and ethics interweave these classical philosophies with the newer orthodox Christian doctrines, and leaves us with a system that strives to articulate a comprehensive understanding of the divine, and of course its interaction with our human experience. The nature of God. Thomas's arguments for the existence of gods certainly not gods, are foundational in classic theistic philosophy. So let's just briefly explain them. He presents these 5 ways, in Latin quinque viae, in his work Summa Theologica, that attempt to demonstrate God's existence logically and naturally. The first being the argument from motion. He argued that everything in motion is moved by something else, and there must be an unmoved mover, which is of course God. Next is the argument from causation, namely, every effect has a cause, and there must be an uncaused cause, which is God. Next is the argument from necessity. Humans observe all things that are contingent, those that can exist or not exist. Therefore, there must be a necessary being whose existence is not contingent, and this being is God. Argument from degrees of perfection. The gradation observed in things suggests that there is a best or most perfect being that is the ultimate source of all existence and perfection, and guess what? That is God. The last being the argument from ordered tendencies of nature. Non-intelligent objects act toward ends, which implies their existence of an intelligent director who guides all natural tendencies toward their goals. And I don't have to tell you who that director is. Through these arguments, Thomas not only intends to prove God's existence, but also to describe his attributes, namely simplicity, infinity, perfection, immutability, and unity. These characteristics outline the conceptual framework that depicts God as the ultimate cause of everything, without being subject to limitations and changes inherent to the created universe. The nature of sin. Aquinas' understandings of sin integrates his metaphysical principles with his ethical and theological concerns. Sin, at least for Thomas, is fundamentally a deviation from reason and God's eternal law. It represents a moral failing that results in the privation of good rather than the presence of an independent evil entity. This view aligns with his broader metaphysical schema that defines evil as a lack of good, something that exists as a deficit rather than a substantive thing. Take, for instance, in our universe, it is not that cold exists, rather just a lack of heat. Integration of faith and reason. For Thomas, faith and reason are harmonious and intertwined. One can lead to an understanding of the other. He held the belief that truths revealed through faith could not contradict those discovered through reason, as both of these things, as with everything, stem from God. This principle allowed Aquinas to employ Aristotelian philosophy to explain Christian doctrine without abandoning the primacy of divine revelation. This approach was not merely to defend theological truths, but also to present them in a systematic and rational format that was also accessible to the scholarly discourse of his time. Theological influence and legacy. The integration of Aristotelian philosophy into Christian theology by Aquinas was initially controversial, but posthumously gained quite a lot of acceptance. His works have become a central element of Catholic education and theological study, influencing countless thinkers and establishing him as a pivotal figure in Western philosophy and theology. His methods and doctrines continue to be studied and widely revered, shaping theological discussions and supporting the view that intellectual inquiry can indeed coexist with faith-based convictions. His extensive discussions on the nature of God, the Trinity, and Christology are integral to understanding his philosophical and theological framework. It is a work that blends rigorous logical analysis with deep theological insight. The Trinity. Aquinas elucidates the concept of the Trinity using philosophical reasoning grounded in doctrine. For Thomas, God is perfectly one in essence, but also distinctly three in persons, namely being the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Each person of the Trinity is God whole and entire, yet each is distinct because of their relationships, i.e., the Father generates the Son is generated by the Father, and the Holy Spirit proceeds from both. This relational distinction does not imply a division in the divine essence, but rather a communion of persons sharing pretty much the same divine nature. Thomas's Christology is deeply incarnational, emphasizing that Christ is the true God and true man. This duality of nature was not a mixture of confusion, but a union in one person. The incarnation of the Word in Jesus Christ is central to Thomas's theological narrative, where the divine nature did not undergo any change, but rather took on a human nature to accomplish the salvation of humanity. Through the incarnation, God made it possible for humans to overcome sin and attain salvation, a process that could not be achieved through human effort alone. According to Thomas, the primary purpose of the incarnation was to restore human nature from the corruption of sin. The soteriological theme is prominent in his writings, where he argues that Christ's redemptive death was necessary for the repair of human nature. Through his sacrifice, Christ offers satisfaction for the sins of humanity, a theme that aligns with the satisfaction theory of atonement. The sacraments are another key area of focus in Thomas's theology. He views the sacraments as the primary means through which the grace of God is imparted to believers. Each sacrament confers grace according to its own form and purpose, thus contributing to the spiritual growth and salvation of the individual. He also delves deeply into moral theology, discussing virtues and the principles of moral decision-makings, and his views of ethics is rather teleological, grounding human mortality in the ultimate purpose or end, the telos of human life, which he identifies as union with God. This end is achieved through the practice of virtues, both natural and theological, which orient a person towards defined beatitude. Now, finally, just to finish up, we must say that the impact of Thomas Aquinas' thought on Western Christianity is profound. His synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine set a precedent in theological and philosophical reasoning that continues to influence Catholic thought and beyond. His method of using reason to explore faith elements has established him as a foundational figure in the development of the scholastic tradition within Christianity. And that being said, one must remember that Christianity is indeed a very broad religion. We are mainly speaking in this video from the Catholic perspective, and not all Christians are Catholic. In fact, many Christian sects and individuals have very great disagreements, we will say, with the Catholic Church, many of which are quite obvious. But we must give credence to all people who want to come out and put their thoughts down in academic journals and show us their opinions, all in good faith. Let's hear them out, and then make judgments later on. Of course, let us not tiptoe that line between reason and faith, because we perhaps will find ourselves firmly in one camp, opposing the other. If an argument is not conforming to our preconceived biases, we may immediately judge it as unreasonable. And I think that that is the fatal flaw of Thomas Aquinas, with all due respect. Of course, that's just my personal opinion. How about you tell me what you think in the comments? You see how I did that? Ask you to make the comment to drive up the viewer engagement. Well, perhaps it will be reasonable for you to do so, but I will have faith that you will. Well, first I would like to thank my top-tier Patreon subscribers. That's Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, and Susan. Thank you very much for keeping the channel going. If you, my friend, would like to make a contribution, then you know what to do. Find the Patreon link in the description and make a reasonable decision. Now, with that being said, I would like to wish you all the best. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video. Good night, everyone.